Well, thank you, Herman, for a very handsome introduction, which persuaded me at least that I was in danger of having no unpublished thoughts. And it's some distinction, I think, to be introduced by anyone with the name of Gallegos, because as those of you who know Spain will know, the Gallegos, or inhabitants and descendants of the motherland of Galicia, are some tough guys. They number among themselves General Franco and Fidel Castro, Manuel Fraga Iribarne, and many others. So they're not always as warm and tender as Herman has just been in his presentation of myself. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and if I hope I may get away with brothers and sisters and even comrades and friends, for coming. And if you think this is water, that's entirely up to you. Now, it's not as easy a task that confronts me as you may suppose. For one thing, once a publisher approaches you and asks if you'll compose letters to the young, you know that you look middle-aged, not just to yourself, but to everybody else. For another thing, as I discovered while writing these letters, some of them are rewrites in the sense that I'd written them before, or was in the course of writing them, to actual students of mine, graduate students. Most of these letters are to real people. Actually, they're all to real people. Rather worryingly, I found you can't lie to the young, or you shouldn't try, or if you do try, you won't get away with it. There's a wonderful poem by Yevtushenko from the early 60s called Telling Lies to the Young is Wrong, which was in my head as I was writing. I don't mean to say I've been getting away with lies and fibs and exaggerations all the rest of the time, by any means, or even tried to stretch things rhetorically, or anything of the sort. I wouldn't want to leave you with that impression. It's just that when you're writing to the young, you have to give them your best and straightest answer. And it's a good exercise, and I recommend it to all of you. And now I find myself, having written about how to be a dissenter, how to be a contrarian, I find myself in the odd position of being coming before you at a time when I'm a very militant member of the overwhelming majority. Because in the matter of this recent war, which I'm going to mention just a little, I was from the first only worried that there would be insufficient will to prosecute it on the part of the US government. I would consider myself a critical member of this large majority. I'm not an Ashcroftian. Having written a piece for Vanity Fair immediately after September 11th saying that after 20 years of being a green card holder and having become the father of 3 Americans, and having for a long time thought that if I went around saying I was an American, some people might not believe me, I nonetheless thought it was time to take out the papers and get it done, and as an act of solidarity, become a US citizen. And then the Attorney General informed me that if I remained a green card holder, I could be arrested and executed without knowing the charges against me, and in secret. And I thought, well, I can't pass up an opportunity like that. So in solidarity with the 20 million other people who've had their habeas corpus taken away, I say, you can have my body, mate, but my habeas corpus not. Therefore, I think I count as a critical member of the large majority. I should confess it at once. On the morning of the 11th of September last, I had in common with a lot of people a number of emotions, mammalian feelings, instant flood of mammalian feeling. Anger, disgust, not fear. I don't claim to be fearless, but I'm not afraid of these people or people like them. But the usual register of emotions that most people recall, including solidarity. But there was another one that I couldn't quite place that was in my gamut of mammalian register, and it took a day or two for it to disclose itself. But I knew it was there, and I finally found what it was. It was, and I hope I can say this without the risk of indecency. It was exhilaration. Why did I feel exhilarated? I'll tell you why I did. I thought, well, here is the enemy in as plain and clear a view as it could possibly be. Theocratic fascism, disclosed in its most horrific form. And I thought, well, if that's the battle, if they want a clash of civilization, they can have one. And I will never get bored with prosecuting it. And I only hope that it's fought properly and diligently and thoroughly. And if it goes on for the rest of my life, that's fine. Because there's no possibility of giving in such a war or compromising, let alone of entertaining the possibility of defeat. This is serious. So I may as well tell you that at the beginning. The opportunist element then occurred to me. I've got a book coming out. How ridiculous to be selling a book about my own thoughts and my own students at such a time. I actually really did feel like calling off the book tour, and did call it off for a while in order to go to Pakistan and to Kashmir. And by the way, I should thank the club for being so generous as to rebook me for this evening. And I came back even more convinced that I was right the first time. And I thought, well, actually, look, what have I said in my book that I could decently put in front of an audience at a time like this? Well, I'm going to read to you from 3 particular bits of it. One, I write about what to me was the warning of this war, which didn't begin on the 11th of September this year, but on the 14th of February 1989, when the theocratic leader of Iran issued in his own name the offer of a bounty for the murder of a writer of fiction who wasn't a citizen of Iran, my friend Salman Rushdie. In other words, we had there what we have now, a factional fight among extremists in the Islamic world, which is riven with this fight, where those who hope to win this fight for the most ultimate fanatical fundamentalism try to win it by taking it to the West. That would be my diagram of what's happening. That started to happen in February 1989. It was a warning. Well, I've written about that. I'm going to read you a bit about it. The second thing that I spent a lot of the last 10 years doing was, generally speaking, warning about the dangers of ethno-theocratic or ethno-spiritual, or if you like, ethno-religious feeling, the mad combination of religion with ideology. And third, a lot of time on the attempt to prevent the massacre, not just the massacre, the erasure of the culture of the Muslim people of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, the Muslim population of Europe, something that was thought a matter of indifference by many people, but seemed to me should be stopped, should be prevented. One couldn't face the Muslim world in any manner or on any matter, having acquiesced in the destruction of their European co-religionists. So not just complacently, therefore, but with some confidence that all these things were worth doing and were worth writing about. I'll read you a passage or two. The first one is about the fatwa. I start with some sentences that belong to the previous letter. It's a reply. And then I say, there is a small paradox here. The job of supposed intellectuals is to combat oversimplification or reductionism, and to say, well, actually, it's more complicated than that. At least that's part of the job. However, you must have noticed how often certain complexities are introduced as a means of obfuscation. And here it becomes necessary to ply with some glee the celebrated razor of old Occam, to dispose of unnecessary assumptions and to proclaim that actually things are less complicated than they appear. Very often in my experience, the extraneous or the irrelevant complexities are inserted when a matter of elementary justice or principle is at issue. My best illustration here would be the case of Salman Rushdie. You would think, perhaps, that when he was assaulted by a theocratic fatwa in 1989, his fellow authors would have rushed to his defense. Here was an open incitement to murder, accompanied by the offer of a bounty, and directed at a writer of fiction who wasn't even a citizen of the said theocracy. But you would have been astonished to see the amount of muttering and hanging back that went on. I interrupt myself here, this isn't in the book, to say that when George Bush Sr., then president, was asked for his comment on this fatwa, he said, as far as he could see, it involved no American interest. And I remember Susan Sontag that day saying rather splendidly, well, it would be contemptible to point out to the president such a small thing as the fact that Mr. Rushdie's wife was then an American who'd gone into hiding with him. That would be paltry, but perhaps the issue of free expression or free speech or the right to write novels unimpeded by threats of murder for bounty had some connection with the defense of the US Constitution. I mention this because I want to have it pointed out that some of us have been fighting this war against religious fascism before the Bush family joined in, We're perfectly happy to see them join us, but we would have been fighting it whether they wanted to or not, and we'll be carrying it on even if they threaten to give up. But these were the sort of questions that were asked at the time by supposed intellectuals. Had Salman's novel perhaps been offensive? Were the feelings of pious Muslims not to be considered? Was he not asking for trouble? Surely he knew what he was doing, and so forth. In public debates with those who worried about the blasphemous or profane element in the novel, or who said that they did, I would always begin by saying, look, let's get one thing out of the way. May I assume that you are opposed, without reservation, to the suborning of the murder for pay of a literary figure? It was quite educational to see how often this assurance would be withheld, or would only be offered in a qualified form. And in those cases, I would refuse flatly to debate any further. So I was a reductionist in that instance, and very proud indeed of my simple-mindedness. Now from that point, which I hope is obvious, and I hope also, because I like the obvious, I don't think it should be overlooked. Don't want to be married to it, but I don't mind being engaged to it. And which I hope will remind you of some rather temporizing remarks that have recently been made about not upsetting fanatics or being more soothing towards them. I'll pass from a more general to a more general assault on what I believe to be the contemptible practice of religion. Again, I address my young student this way. You seem to have guessed from some remarks I've already made in passing that I am not a religious believer. In order to be absolutely honest, I should not leave you with the impression that I am part of the generalized agnosticism of our culture. I'm not even an atheist. I am an anti-theist. I not only maintain that all religions are versions of the same untruth, but I hold that the influence of churches and the effect of religious belief is positively harmful. Reviewing the false claims of religion, I do not wish, as some sentimental agnostics affect to wish, that these claims were true. I do not envy believers their faith. I am relieved to think that the whole story is a sinister fairy tale. Life would be miserable if what the faithful affirmed was actually the case. Why do I say that? Well, there may be people who wish to live their lives under a cradle-to-grave divine supervision, a permanent surveillance and round-the-clock monitoring, a celestial North Korea. But I cannot personally imagine anything more horrible or more grotesque. It would be much worse in a way if the supervision was benign. I'll repeat that for effect. It would be much worse if the supervision was benign. I have my answer ready if I turn out to be mistaken about this. At the bar of judgment, I shall argue that I deserve credit for an honest conviction of unbelief, and must in any case be acquitted of the charge of hypocrisy or sycophancy. If the omnipotent and omniscient one does turn out to be of the loving kind, I would expect this plea to do me more good than any trashy casuistry of the sort popularized by Blaise Pascal. And one could also fall back, if time pressed, upon the less principled and more shiftily empirical defense that was offered by Bertrand Russell. "O Lord, you did not give us enough evidence." I think that this conviction does bear upon the mental and moral resources that are necessary if one hopes to live on the contrary, if one hopes to live in dissent, or if one hopes to live as if one were free. In a very much quoted reflection on America's original sin of slavery, Thomas Jefferson said, "I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just." However, if there really was a God, and he really was just, then there would be little enough for believers to tremble about. It would be a consolation that would infinitely outweigh any imaginable earthly care. I've met many brave men and women, morally much superior to myself, whose courage in adversity derives from their faith. But whenever they have chosen to speak or write about it, I've found myself appalled by the instant decline of their intellectual and their moral standards. They want God on their side, and they believe they are doing his work. Now, what is this, even at its very best, but an extreme form of solipsism? In other words, Don't mind me, I'm just doing God's work. I'm very modest. A poor syllogism. Or I'm very humble. Humility is defined by that. This is to proceed from the conclusion to the evidence. Our greatest resource is the mind, and the mind is not well trained by being taught to assume what has to be proved. Their arrogance and illogic is inseparable, even in the meekest and most altruistic religious affirmations. A true believer must believe that he or she is there for a purpose and is an object of real interest to a supreme being. He or she must also claim to have at least an inkling of what that supreme being desires. I have been called arrogant myself in my time, and I hope to earn the title again. But to claim that I am privy to the secrets of the universe and its creator, that's quite beyond my conceit. I therefore have no choice but to find something suspect even in the humblest believer, let alone in the great lawgivers and edict makers of whose flock, and what a revealing word that is, they form a part. Even the most humane and compassionate of the monotheisms and polytheisms are complicit in this quiet and irrational authoritarianism. They proclaim us in Fulk Grovel's unforgettable line to be created sick and commanded to be well. And there are totalitarian insinuations to back this up if its appeal should fail. Christians, for example, declare me redeemed by a human sacrifice that occurred thousands of years before I was born. I did not ask for this human sacrifice. I would willingly have foregone it, but there it is. I'm claimed and saved whether I wish it or not. And if I refuse this unsolicited gift, well, there are still some vague mutterings about an eternity of torment for my ingratitude. This is somewhat worse than a big brother state or a dear leader state, because there could be no hope of its eventually passing away. I can speak with more experience of the Christian propaganda since I was baptized as an Anglican, educated at a Methodist boarding school with compulsory religious instruction, which I enjoyed and which taught me a good deal, and was once received by accident into the Greek Orthodox Church for reasons that are here irrelevant. But I also had a Jewish mother and was once married by a distinguished rabbi who I suspected of being a secret Einsteinian agnostic. Judaism has some advantages over Christianity in that, for example, it does not proselytize, except among Jews, and it does not make the cretinous mistake of saying that the Messiah has already made his appearance. When Maimonides says that the Messiah will come, but that he may tarry, well, that's exactly in the Maimonides text, of course written in Arabic, but that's how it comes out. When Maimonides says that the Messiah will come, but that he may tarry, we see the origin of every Jewish shrug from Spinoza to Woody Allen. However, along with Islam and Christianity, Judaism does insist that some turgid and contradictory and sometimes evil and mad texts, obviously written by fairly unexceptional humans, are in fact the Word of God. I think that the indispensable condition of any intellectual liberty is the realization that there is no such thing. So, I had thought of intruding a lighter note at this point, and I may as well do it now. What? What's that? What's this giggling? Because the question, one of the questions I have to answer in this book, and in a way by being the way I am or carrying on the way I do, is how can you be a pain in the ass all day, or at least all the time? And it's very difficult. Sort of trying keeping up morale and look and trying to force yourself not to give in to the prevailing drool, and how to avoid, in a sense, apathy or despair. I just here's the shortest letter in the book. It's the 8th letter, the 8th epistle. How to ward off atrophy and routine, you ask? Well, I can give you a small and perhaps ridiculous example. Every day, the New York Times carries a motto in a box on its front page. All the news that's fit to print, it says. It's been saying it for decades, day in and day out. I imagine that most readers of the canonical sheet have long ceased to notice this bannered and flaunted symbol of the newspaper's mental furniture. But I myself check every day to make sure that the bright, smug, pompous, idiotic claim is still there. And then I check to make sure that it still irritates me. And if I can still exclaim under my breath, why do they insult me? And what do they take me for? And what the hell is it supposed to mean? Unless it's as obviously complacent and conceited and censorious as it seems to be, then at least I know I still have a pulse. In my hometown, I do the same with the Washington Post. I check every day to make sure it still has horoscopes, which has the same effect, has exactly the same effect on me. And then I close to my young reader by saying, you may wish to choose a more rigorous mental workout, but I credit this daily infusion of annoyance with extending my lifespan. Okay, now I'll try and, I must keep an eye on the clock, but I'll tell you a little of what I wrote about what I thought was the crucial matter of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Dante was a sectarian and a mystic, but he was right to reserve one of the fieriest corners of his inferno for those who, in a time of moral crisis, try to remain neutral. So, since you asked me to go on less like a whiskered veteran and say a bit more about the art of dissent than the science, I shall try and be obliging. Again, I'm going to mention some examples from my own limited experience. I always feel slightly self-conscious about doing this, but at least the stories are first-hand, and I have noticed myself that when reading the work of other authors, I never resent the autobiographical. You see my ingratiating introduction here. So I shall pretend that I'm a stranger to all forms of modesty, especially including the false. I have been arrested a few times in various countries, and roughed up a few times as well, and once spent a brief time in jail in Prague during the dying days of the Stalinist regime. I've also heard the occasional shot fired in anger. But most of this was, if I'm to be frank, the result of some pretty minor, marginal engagements in which I chose to involve myself. I once made a speech at a street rally against an apartheid-era South African cricket team, which led the British police to grab and hold me on a charge of incitement to riot. I remember distinctly being disappointed as well as relieved when that charge was dropped. There had been something flattering in the tribute to my rhetorical skill. But as you see, I've done mainly summer soldiering. The war in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the early 1990s changed all that for me, and for many other people I knew. It might sound provincial and, oh dear me, Eurocentric to say this, but not even those of us who'd taken the gloomiest view of the arms race and the Cold War had ever expected to see a full-dress reprise in Europe of internment camps, the mass murder of civilians, the reinstitution of torture and rape and deportation as acts of policy. This was the sort of thing we'd read about from 6 decades before. Some of us, including myself, had met and got to know some survivors of that period. And of course, in a recess of our minds, we'd played the imaginary game. What would I do about the knock on the door? How would I react if the neighbors were being marched off to the station? That tired analogy turned out to be uncomfortably useful, because when all this ghastliness did get underway again, the political class in Europe and America behaved for the most part with the same wretched combination of complacency and complicity that it had exhibited when fascism first came to call. I haven't got the space to tell the full story here, but I'll do some polemical itemization of the main headings. In the 20th century, which was forced to invent the word genocide, the Ottoman Turks had exterminated the Christian Armenians, and the Nazi Germans had tried to eliminate all the Jews. Both outrages took place under the cover of a wider world war and in occupied or disputed territories where there were few independent witnesses. The attempt to close the century by destroying the Muslims of Bosnia took place in broad daylight and was captured on film and was the cause of the war and not a vile subtext of it. 2. Bosnia had a Muslim plurality but had long been a multicultural polity. Many Muslims were themselves secular. The capital city of Sarajevo was a place of mingling and synthesis where large communities of Serbs, Croats, Jews, and Bosniaks did rather more than merely coexist. 3. Unlike Serbia and Croatia, the two main contending parties in the Balkan Wars, Bosnia did not have and never has had any claims on anyone else's territory. The assault on Bosnia and the brutish siege of Mostar as well as Sarajevo was concocted in advance by an agreement between two ostensible rivals, the nostalgic fascist Mr. Tudjman and the born-again National Socialist Mr. Milosevic. This mini version of the Hitler-Stalin Pact was known about by NATO and can be confirmed in the records kept by the participants. 4. Since the aggression against Bosnia openly involved a declared wish for territory and a declared distaste for the existing inhabitants, it very quickly disclosed itself as a war of massacre. We want the land, we don't want the people. Always look to the language. The term cleansing was bluntly employed on Belgrade TV to describe the process of emptying and ruining the flourishing towns along the River Drina. And always look to the aesthetic also. Most of the destruction and desecration of Bosnia's mosques and cemeteries and cultural sites took place during ceasefires as part of a planned erasure that scorned the disguise of collateral damage. I might add here that it seems to me that when the Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces earlier this year used heavy artillery to destroy the Hellenic Buddhist sculptures of Bamiyan on the Afghan border, that was another warning too. 5. Serbian and Croatian irredentists and cleansers openly fought under the banners of their respective Christian Orthodox and Roman Catholic faiths and were often blessed by priests and by prelates. The Bosnians resisted for the most part as Bosnians. The upshot of this was that they were invariably described as the Muslims, whereas no broadcast ever reported that today Catholic forces destroyed the bridge at Mostar or Orthodox bombardment set fire to the National Library of Bosnia in Sarajevo. 6. Given the uneven way that borders and populations actually intersect in Europe and the Balkans and the Caucasus, it would be suicidal to allow the forcible triumph of a demagogic and dictatorial regime which sought to impose the tyrannical notion of congruence between race and state. This would negate the whole idea of Europe, not to say civilization, and could only lead to more war and to more despotism. This was obvious to me in 1992, and it seems even more plain today. And that's where I broke off, or where I paused anyway, about a year ago, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll hope that you can guess, therefore, why I think it is a timely moment to be discussing how and why to combat all current and future fusions of the ethno-nationalist and theocratic, and why it is that the United States, with its pluralism and multiculturalism, is the special country and special terrain on which that battle has to be fought. Very grateful to you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher Hitchens, columnist for Vanity Fair and The Nation and author of Letters to a Young Contrarian, for your remarks. Now, Dr. Orville Schell, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, will conduct our question and answer session. Dr. Schell.
Well, our thanks to our host, Herman Gallegos, who's our chair tonight. We have a large number of very interesting questions. I'm actually quite impressed by their acuity, so let's get right to them. If you were president of the U.S. right now, what would you do? And what would you have done differently with regard to terrorism before September 11th?
Everybody knows the joke about the people who are lost in Ireland and stop to ask directions and say whether they want to get to Carrickfergus and are told, well, if you want to get there, you shouldn't be starting from here. The reason why I said earlier that I thought that I had at one stage the worry that the war against the Al-Qaeda organization and the Taliban regime would not be conducted with sufficient vigor by this administration was this. The two main pillars of United States policy in that region are and have been for a long time, and this is most especially true under Republican regimes, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which are the military and ideological and theological and financial patrons of the Taliban and of Al-Qaeda. To this day, you've probably been reading, some of you, how even in the dying weeks of the battle, the Pakistanis were still doing their best to rescue as many Taliban and Al-Qaeda people as they could. An embarrassment for US policy. I was afraid the policy might become a hostage to that. And I still, to some extent, am. In June this year, I was very honored by the invitation to be the one of the founding signatories of a petition that went around Washington about the enslavement of 50% of the women of the population of Afghanistan, the female part. And my name is still on this petition, which did well, but didn't get any attention in what you might call political Washington at all. Basically asked the administration, can it be true that the United States recognizes this government as the government of Afghanistan? I would have gone further and said it's obviously actually a Pakistani occupation of Afghanistan, as well as a grotesque tyranny that's led to beggary and enslavement. But you couldn't get any traction for that subject then in DC at all. And as some of you remember, Secretary of State Colin Powell handed at about that point a subvention of some, I forget, $4.5 million, I believe, to the Taliban in gratitude for its help in the war on drugs. A war which is as totalitarian abroad as it is at home. That's where we were until quite recently. So there are a lot of things I would have been doing differently if I had been president, and we wouldn't have had to start from there. And Mr. Bin Laden's family, to the number of some 12 members, would not have been flown out of the United States on the 12th of September by a plane chartered by Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, my next-door neighbor in Washington, D.C., the Saudi ambassador. I couldn't fly that day, neither could any of you. Every American was grounded, but it was possible to get an airplane out of U.S. airspace carrying a dozen members of the Bin Laden family with clearance from the CIA, chartered by Prince Bandar. I still want to know who made that possible and what it was they were in such a hurry about. And that's why we're left now with this the appalling situation of a national security regime which has been for years given millions and millions and millions of dollars to talk loud about national security and terrorism, which it seems knew or could have known about and had identified many of the perpetrators of the 11th of September aggression against American civil society, but did not do so. And so now presents us with the following syllogism. We let you down. We didn't protect you. We betrayed you. We covered up for Prince Bandar and the Pakistanis and the Bin Laden family. It's the greatest intelligence failure in American history. We must now be given supreme power over every one of your movements. It doesn't work for me. I hope it doesn't work for you.
Well, following up on that question, this question wants to know, having been both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, do you believe bin Laden will be caught or killed? And what impact will that have on our safety in the U.S.? And one might also parenthetically add, what would be the best way for the United States to treat both bin Laden and other al-Qaeda captives?
I should say I wasn't so brave or so lucky as to actually get across the Afghan border. I went to the border of Afghanistan, to Peshawar, during the bombing. If you're in Peshawar, you are in Pashtunistan at any rate. The Pashtuns don't recognize the border at that point, which was drawn by Sir Frederick Durand, yet another disastrous British partitionist. Only really a few decades ago. You know, when you start looking at it, Ireland, India, Palestine, Cyprus, this British partition racket stops looking like coincidence, doesn't it? Kashmir. So, in effect, I was in Afghanistan, but you might say not technically, and I was in Kashmir. And I think Mr. bin Laden is still in that vicinity, actually he's on that very border. And my own wish would be that he be captured by the British, because they have announced that if they capture him, they won't give him to Mr. Ashcroft, because British law doesn't allow, nor does Spanish law, nor European Union law does not allow the delivery of suspects or wanted people or detainees to secret courts which can conduct executions without evidence. That should be self-evident. In other words, you can't give a defendant to, I don't want to get personal, ladies and gentlemen, or to anyone who might be listening to this, but European law doesn't allow you to hand over your captives to a banana republic. Sorry to have to put it like that, but there you are, which in turn means, of course, that the Ashcroft policy is positively endangering everyone in this room and everybody listening, because it's inhibiting the Ashcroft, having rounded up God knows how many people, hasn't got a single suspect yet. Okay. Not one person's been charged with anything. Notable, the Spanish police have arrested 8 members of the Al-Qaeda network, which is a lot better work than the FBI and the CIA have done. But they're not going to give them to any old court. So the Ashcroft policy is endangering you, have to understand it. In the same way as his refusal to indict General Pinochet for letting off a car bomb in Washington, D.C., for which his criminal division now has all the evidence. His refusal to issue that indictment is endangering you. His job is to protect you from foreign despots who want to let off bombs in Washington, D.C. He's not doing it either. So I think the case for the impeachment of the Attorney General is now pretty much complete. For the rest of them, you asked, well, I personally hope that as few as possible of them are allowed to escape. That's my view. Of the Al-Qaeda rank and file, if you can dignify them with the term, I hope most of them are killed. As many as possible of them are killed, without compunction, and as comprehensively as possible. Those who are able to relocate, I would suggest somewhere like Mindanao in the southern Philippines is the likeliest place, can be hunted down there and killed there instead. But I would like to see a lot more of Mr. bin Laden myself, and I'd like to see him on trial in London, and I'd like to see Mullah Omar on trial. Also, with Mullah Omar, who was notionally at least a head of government, there would also, I think, be the possibility of taking him to The Hague, because matters of war crimes committed by state could be adduced. We could get a very interesting test case going about that. So that's my hope, my wish.
Well, moving to an ancillary problem, how would you solve the Israeli-Palestine conflict?
I thought you'd never ask. Well, as I found when speaking to the young, as I was telling you, you can't lie or you can't evade. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that this is a youthful audience, or that the people listening are young. I'm one of those of partly Jewish parentage and affiliation, and others who's for long, I'm not in anything like a majority this time, but there are quite a lot of us, who think that Zionism is a stupid idea to begin with. Okay? That it is a disaster for the Arab inhabitants of Palestine has been obvious from the very first day, but leaving that to one side, as if one could, I would say that to answer a famous old question, much asked in the shtetl, is it good for the Jews? The answer is no. It is not good for the Jews to be invited to follow an ethno-nationalist, messianic path that puts them into an inevitable quarrel because it involves the annexation of land, in particular of Holy Land, if you can believe in such a concept, with the inhabitants of the region, a region where until then they had no quarrels. For centuries, Jewish refugees from Europe went to Turkey or to Bosnia or North Africa to get away from Christian persecution. They had no quarrel with the Muslim world. Now they've got one of those too. It's a nightmare. It need never have happened. And so I can't forget the fact that I'm a root and branch anti-Zionist. But it's too late for all that now. I don't think the United Kingdom is a good idea for a state either. Lots of states have been founded on ridiculous principles, and there they are. They still have, so to speak, the right to exist. So that gives us now a quadrilateral of alternatives, which are very simply adumbrated. First, the first option would be this. Everyone under the lands claimed by Israeli jurisdiction could become a member of a single unitary state, where anyone who was a subject was also a citizen with the same rights, whether they were Arab or Muslim, or Jewish, or Druze, or Armenian. That, unfortunately, is now impossible. There could be an expulsion of the remaining Palestinian population, completing the expulsion begun in 1947-48. Much talked about in Israel now. It's called the transfer. Get them all out, invite many more Jewish immigrants in, have a completely Jewish state that was Arab-free, which would, as well as being an outrageous injustice, would lead to a 1,000-year war in the region, at least, but is being argued for. You could have a continuation of the status quo, basically an apartheid system, where it's now, I think, acknowledged by everyone that this is unbearable and insufferable, insupportable. It's now thought to be insufferable for the Israelis too. It's been insufferable for a very, very long time for the Palestinians who are entering their 4th year either occupation or dispossession. Or you could have two states, one for each. Those are the only four alternatives. Okay? Now, shall I say what they are again? I don't think I need to. The fourth is the only thinkable one, absolutely the only possible one. It should have been proclaimed a very long time ago. And the terrible worry is that it now will only be adopted when it's too late. But that will not be the fault of those of us who've always argued that if there are two peoples and two nations in one territory, that means that if one of them has a state, even the Balfour Declaration says this, so must the other one.
Mr. Hitchens,
Sir.
do you believe there are absolute Western values that ought to be protected to the extent of invading even sovereign nations?
Well, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of Western values, and I never use the term because here we are in San Francisco, which is Western in a way, but where would you put Athens, say, or Crete, in relation to that? Is it to our east? I would say it's a great deal to our east, but what we think of as Western values very largely come from 5th century Hellenic conversations. So I don't think there's any geographical location for these values, and I think there's always the danger of ethnocentrism when one suggests that there is, and that's to say nothing against the wonders of the West Coast. What I would prefer to say was that there are Enlightenment values, some of them deriving from Greece, some of them from Italy, some of them from Scotland, many of them from Germany and England and Spain, and indeed many of them from the Muslim world, which kept the Greek libraries and texts alive when they'd been lost to the Christian world and brought them back to our attention through the cultural fusion in Andalusia in southern Spain in the days of roughly of Maimonides. So, yes, these values of free inquiry, a scientific method, the central importance of the individual, and so forth are, I think, what I would define as the core of the Enlightenment cause. Do they give one the right to invade another country? No. But they would give one the duty to do so if one was attacked. They would impose upon one, in my view, that duty, because these are principles that we do not have the right to give up. We have only the duty to preserve them and elaborate upon them and practice them as much as we can and pass them on. But it must be made very, very plain to those who do not share these values and would replace them with the idea that all society needs is one book and one rule and one text or one Godhead, whatever it is that they calamitously choose in this respect, or whatever excuse they give for it. It must be made unmistakably clear to them that we too have unalterable convictions, that our culture demands respect as well and will exact it if need be. There's no condescension involved here, but there's no masochism either. And we don't hold our convictions as acts of faith, but as acts of as matters of conviction freely arrived at. But let never that be mistaken for weakness.
We have had a bountiful harvest of Noam Chomsky questions, but let's just try one. Of what magnitude would an attack on the U.S. have to be for Noam Chomsky to agree with retaliation?
Do you think, because that's too easy a return served for me, that you might offer the audience a bouquet of Chomsky questions?
I think one ought to be sufficient for you, Mr. Hitchens.
Well, I'm sure some of you here, but perhaps not all the listeners, will understand what the grammar of the question is. Professor Chomsky, since the events of the 11th of September, has been, in effect, conducting how shall I put it, a professorial moral equivalence campaign. In other words, his efforts in writing and in speaking have been to say that the use of cruise missiles against New York is no different from the use of cruise missiles against any other place. And thus it's an occasion for the United States to reflect on the number of times it has created wailing and gnashing of teeth in other places. I think that I shouldn't perhaps insult you by saying what I think is wrong with that. Well, at the risk of doing so, I'll say that to make civilian casualties your object and to make civilian casualties your method, as was done on the 11th of September, in other words, the cruise missiles are planes packed with terrified, paralyzed or screaming civilians before they hit the civilian target buildings, and to do this in the name of an ideology that has already made Afghanistan the only country where it is regnant, a country of beggary, slavery, and destitution, is, I think, to have created a new situation. And thus what is wrong with those who try and look for comparisons or exculpatory counterexamples is quite simply this. They fail to recognize, never mind what I think of as the extreme vulgarity of their attempt at moral equivalence. The big objection would be this: they quite simply cannot see or recognize a new situation when it confronts them. They're unwilling to give up what was to them a consoling and comforting and repetitive worldview. Rather, they assimilate this to that and say, well, it reminds me of another atrocity I once wrote about, and go on as if nothing had happened. In no respect will this do. In no respect will this do, and it's led to intellectual and, I think, moral disgrace on the part of Professor Chomsky, who only recently, at a gathering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I say only recently, it was about exactly 1 month after the assault on New York and Washington and Pennsylvania, announced that in his view the United States was engaged in a genocide campaign in Afghanistan with the objective of killing by one means or another 2 to 3 million Afghan civilians. And adding, he said that rather weirdly, there was almost no comment about this genocide campaign in the American press. And my own comment on this in The Nation was it was very clever of him to spot that. And arguably very brave of him to be the only one to mention it. But that it would mean that a judgment had to be passed on really his fitness to be making speeches on this kind of thing at all.
When Henry Kissinger spoke here, he called accusations made against him irresponsible. These, I suppose, are those that you yourself made in your article and book. He said he wouldn't respond to them. He also has said that he is a big boy and can take care of himself. Has he made any meaningful reply to your Harper's piece about him or your book?
He's a small boy. And he has other people take care of him, and shelters behind other people. So that's the short answer to that. Well, let me give you an instance, just a recent one, since my book came out, in which I make the accusation that he had perfect knowledge of the plan to invade East Timor, the plan by the Indonesian generals in 1975, that he knew what that would mean for the people of East Timor, that he collaborated with them in advance and provided them the military means with which to conduct the invasion, even though it broke American law. That's what I allege, and I point out that in his memoirs, he doesn't mention East Timor once, even in the index, but that on the occasions he's been pressed on it, there are only 2 public events where he's ever been asked, he denied all knowledge, said the whole thing came as a surprise to him, and he knew nothing of the plans or their execution. Well, last week in Washington, there was declassified the conversation between Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger and General Suharto in Jakarta, in Indonesia, on the day of the invasion of East Timor. And as always with Henry Kissinger, everything you suspected was true. And as always with Henry Kissinger, it was just very slightly worse than you thought it was going to be. There's a little pornographic extra detail in the thing. He makes it clear to Suharto, who says, look, we're going to invade East Timor this afternoon. He said, yeah, I know. Would you mind delaying it till after our plane has left Indonesian airspace? Because that will give us some deniability. Suharto says, yeah, we can do that. So you're going to need some weapons, aren't you? Suharto says, yes, your weapons to be exact. Well, Kissinger said, well, the thing about that is if you can make the least of it as possible, because it's, American law says you're not supposed to use our weapons for this purpose. Suharto says, well, we're going to need them, and Kissinger says, well, you can have them, and I'll make sure you go on getting them, but we should be discreet about it. But here's the sinister bit. So here we have the conspiracy to break international law. East Timor was a Portuguese possession under United Nations trusteeship. It's not legal for Indonesia to cross its border and take its territory. And to break American law. You can't use American weapons to do that. So they calmly get that out of the way, and then Kissinger says rather nervously, well, how long do you think the resistance there will go on? Because it's clear that Indonesia wants the land and not the people. And do you think it'll be long guerrilla war, long resistance, or a short one? And Suharto says, we think it can be put down relatively quickly. It probably won't go on very long. In other words, we know we'll take care of them. I think, prima facie, that's a violation of the Genocide Convention, because it had to be understood very, very soon after that conversation took place what Indonesia was doing, and the Genocide Convention makes it incumbent on anyone with knowledge, or any government with knowledge of an attempt to destroy a people in whole or in part, to act not just to prevent, but to punish it. So we're looking at the text a bit more carefully, but it is as revolting as it can be. Now, there's been one mention of it, I think, in the Washington Post. Generally speaking, it hasn't been publicized because what it says can't be true by the reigning standards of our media. It cannot be true that a friend of Charlie Rose and Ted Koppel and Jim Lehrer and Katharine Graham and Abe Rose, all of them, that it can't be true that this guy who's their guest all the time is a deliberate stone-cold mass murderer and errand boy for fascist dictators. But that is true about him, and it's the only thing about him that is. Everything else is propaganda. So the great moment about his appearance here, by the way, was, I mean, I wrote these pieces and I published them in England so that he could sue me there. Because the English libel laws are very, very much more in favor of the plaintiff than the American ones are. I said, come on. And many of the reviewers in London, where he's got quite a following too, said, he can't not sue after Hitchens has said this. But I knew he would not, because he couldn't possibly undergo a discovery process. But when he was asked, I'll just answer the question about what he'd said about me, to comment, he initially refused, wouldn't say, wouldn't be drawn, finally said he thought the book was contemptible, and then when pressed once more said, well, anyway, why should he care what was written about him by an anti-Semite and a denier of the Holocaust? So at that point, I sued him. I've never done such a thing before in my life. I went to a lawyer. I don't do lawyers. I sent him a lawyer's letter saying, see you in court, or take it back. And he immediately, Cravath, Swain and Moore, his contemptible attorneys, wrote back much quicker than we thought they would and said, okay, for now, Henry Kissinger says he won't say that again. Straight away. And so I watched to see when he would next appear and when he'd next be asked, and it was right here. And he was asked, and he didn't say it again. So then I wrote saying, that's not good enough, I want you to retract, which he since has. But I love the fact that, and at least, you know, it's a tiny consolation, but he should have been suing me, and I sued him, and he lost. I make a little holiday in my heart. I hope you'll allow it.
Why don't you do an expose on Bush and Enron?
Oh. Yes. Well, there's a very good piece already done about this by my friend Robert Scheer in the Los Angeles Times. I don't know if you've seen it. But a very good piece about 5-6 days ago. If not, I recommend you get it and pass it around to all your friends. It seems very, very obvious indeed that what happened in this case was you can't call it a conflict of interest because what strikes you about it is the absolute unity of interest between this gang of robbers and the gang of politicians who they sponsored. I mean, it wasn't even one hand washing the other. It was one closed hand, which has since, as you know, sort of gone numb and fallen down at all the... But the extraordinary extent of it, including the robbing of the employees of the company, the robbing of the, especially I understand, of the California utilities, the open kickbacks, the tremendous access into the White House, and the possibility that the change in the top of the energy department was actually dictated by the board of directors of Enron. No, this is the sort of witch hunt that I really like. I think there should be an inquisition. I don't think that the ordinary inquiries will do. Let the witch hunt begin.
On that modest note, perhaps we'll conclude. Our thanks to Christopher Hitchens, author of Letters to a Young Contrarian, columnist for Vanity Fair and The Nation, for joining us here tonight. We also thank you, our audience here in San Francisco, as well as those listening on radio, and invite all of you to join us again soon. Now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California is adjourned.